Tristan had been planning to move to a more eco-friendly, off-the-grid home for quite some time now, and he had finally saved up enough money to buy himself a small piece of land and build a small home on it. He planned on living a more minimalist lifestyle, so the bulk of his budget went towards the equipment to power his home and make it livable. And after doing a ton of research, Tristan had decided to rely on solar energy paired with hydroelectricity. It may have cost him a lot at the time, but in the long run, it seemed like he would be saving money on power while also having less of an impact on the environment. His first few weeks in the cabin were interesting to say the least. Though Tristan was enjoying the idea behind his new lifestyle, it was quite an adjustment. There was a large learning curve, but once he got the hang of things, everything at his new home began to run smoothly. It all kept him quite busy at first, making sure all of the battery packs were properly charging and storing energy, and that his water system was working properly. But when all was said and done, he found his new home to be very peaceful, and his small piece of land was very scenic compared to the small apartment that he was used to living in. Tristan's biggest issue with his new home was the fact that he had thieves that would come by and take things off of his property. He didn't know who they were, he never witnessed it happen, but he would often lose tools or pieces of lumber and firewood. And at first, he thought he might have just been misplacing them. However, as he grew more careful about where he put his tools, they would still go missing. It was growing tiresome, but he figured that he would get a handle on it one day. He had just needed to come up with a trap of some sort. Now, as winter rolled in, Tristan spent most of his time making sure he was keeping his small home warm, and the time spent outside was mainly spent cutting wood or checking on his equipment to make sure that everything was still functioning fine. One day, while he was going outside to gather up some more wood for his fire, he noticed something strange near the side of his house. He could clearly make out the imprint of someone's boot in the snow, and as he followed them, he saw that they led around his entire property. He was so curious as to where the footprints had come from, but no matter how hard he followed the trail, he couldn't seem to see where they started or where they came from. At this point, Tristan was feeling a bit worried and decided to stop following the trail. He just grabbed some of the wood that he had cut up, covered the rest of the pile, and went back inside, and he made sure to lock the door behind him. The rest of his day was spent inside wondering who might have been responsible for the boot prints on his property that he had seen, and when did they get there. That night, Tristan had a hard time getting to sleep, but eventually he was out cold. And while he was already a fairly light sleeper, the fact that he was on edge made him sleep very lightly that night. That's probably why the sound of snow crunching outside of his house was enough to wake him up for once. He could hear the clear pacing of footsteps approaching the side of his house, and as they drew closer, they began following along the walls of Tristan's home. The sound stopped just as it reached the window right above Tristan's head. Everything in his body was telling him to just lie there, as still as possible, and not to look up. But he just couldn't help himself. Tristan was terrified, and it took every ounce of his strength he had to lift his head from his pillow and turn it toward the window. And when his eyes finally met the eyes of what had been wandering around his tiny homestead throughout the winter, he wished he had kept his head down, like his body was telling him to. He couldn't get a clear picture in his head of what was looking back at him from outside of his window. All he could make out were two eyes that would be about the height of the average adult, pressed up against the window, looking directly at him. At first, whoever it was just stared in, not reacting at all to the fact that Tristan was awake and looking right back at it. But once Tristan got visibly scared and pulled back out of fear, whoever it was realized it had been seen, turned away from the window, and ran. Tristan could hear the sound of footsteps getting farther and farther away from his home. The next morning, Tristan was very wary of going outside, but he knew he would have to in order to do his daily chores and maintenance. So he decided that he would bring out his hunting rifle that he owned with him, just so he would feel more comfortable. As he made his way out of his door, he could see the fresh footprints from the visitor the night before. Tristan became more uneasy about being outside, and it now felt like something was staring at him from the tree line. After a moment, he took a deep breath and told himself that everything was going to be fine. This was his new home, and he wasn't going to let anything make him uncomfortable in it. Tristan began cutting wood from the pile and stacking it inside of the doorway, and once he had a steady amount for the day, it was time for him to check on his equipment. After ensuring that everything was fine, he decided that since he was feeling a bit more comfortable, he would take a moment and try to discover where the person had come from the night before. So again, he found himself following the mysterious tracks around his home, and again, There was no clear sign of where they had come from or where they started. Tristan called it quits after a while and decided to head inside and feed the fire. That day, he tried his best to unwind and forget about his visitor, but he couldn't help it. He texted his friend Pat to tell him about the incident, and Pat found it just as bizarre as he did and told him that if he needed any help, to let him know. Tristan appreciated that, but just hoped that everything would be fine and he wouldn't really have to do anything. Despite the fear sitting in his chest, Tristan headed to bed that night and surprisingly had an easy time getting to sleep. And that night he had managed to make it all the way through the evening without waking up once. That didn't mean that there wasn't an incident, though. After happily waking up and seeing that he slept through the entire night, Tristan got out of bed and got ready to grab some firewood. And when he opened the door, he noticed something that would terrify him. He noticed scratch marks near the door panel and on the handle. Someone had tried to force their way into his home last night while he was sleeping, and to make matters worse, the noise didn't wake Tristan up. He immediately grabbed his rifle and made sure to gather as much wood as he could and as quickly as possible. Once he was back inside, he locked the door and put a walking cane up against it to wedge it shut, just to add a little bit of extra security, not that it would really do much. The rest of the day was uneventful, and he ended up telling Pat that he might actually need his help after all. The two friends had decided to meet up the following afternoon because Tristan had decided that enough was enough and that it was time to discover the source of his problem. The two figured that Pat would show up and the two could carefully follow the footprints around Tristan's property, and hopefully they would be able to find where they came from and maybe even who was responsible for making them. That night, Tristan went to sleep and made sure he kept his hunting rifle right next to his bed in case the person came back and managed to get into his home this time. After falling asleep for a few hours, Tristan was woken up once again by the sound of snow crunching under footprints. And within a few seconds, he could feel a pair of eyes looking down on him through the window that was right above his head. Tristan took in a deep breath and used all his might to look up and yell towards the person in the window. His scream visibly startled the man and caused him to step backwards and go sprinting away from Tristan's house faster than the time he did before. Tristan decided to stay up for the rest of the night, and the first thing he did in the morning was message Pat to make sure that everything was still set for the afternoon. As the afternoon approached, Tristan decided to stay inside until his friend showed up, and then he would collect his firewood after he got there, and the two could go searching for the trespasser. And sure enough, after Pat showed up, that's exactly what they did. Tristan cut the wood, and Pat began following the trail around the house. After the two looked around for a bit, Pat was the one who finally found out where the trail was starting. It looked like whoever was trying to break into Tristan's home was coming out of the woods to the south of the property. The two friends discussed it a bit and decided that they would cautiously follow the trail and call the police if anything happened. The trail led them on a 15-minute walk deep into the woods and over the stream that Tristan was using to power his house. And after about 15 minutes of walking, the two friends came across a small cave located in the side of a hill. Pat and Tristan could clearly see the footprints leading into the cave, and after hesitating for a moment, the two decided that they would slowly approach the entrance. As they got closer and closer, Tristan was shocked to see a few of what looked like his tools scattered inside the cave near the entryway. He would have rushed inside the cave to get them, but as they grew closer, the two friends were stopped in their tracks by a sound that came from inside the cave. From deep inside the cave, Tristan and Pat both heard the sharp, high-pitched scream followed by a deep, guttural, gurgling sound. The two looked at each other, confused as to what that was, and then once again they heard the sound of screaming, only this time it sounded as if someone was yelling out in terror. Without saying a word to each other, the two friends turned and began running as fast as they could back to Tristan's home. Once they finally made it, they were both heavily winded and took a moment to catch their breath, and after discussing it for a second, they decided that it probably wasn't a good idea for Tristan to stay there that night, and that he could spend the night at Pat's house. It wasn't an issue, and the two grabbed a few things from Tristan's home and then left the property. The plan was to return the next day, notify the police, and then take it from there. That would all change, though, the second they pulled up to the property the following morning. Tristan was shocked to see that his house had practically been destroyed. There were holes in all of the walls, and every single window had been shattered. Almost everything had been taken out of inside of the house and thrown around the snow-covered property, and in the corners of the house, There were even signs that someone had tried to start a fire. Tristan wasted no time calling the police and letting them know what happened. After they arrived to his property, the two men explained everything to the officers and led them into the woods toward the cave. When they got there, it had been completely emptied. There was hardly any sign of anyone living there, aside from small burned spots on the ground indicating that there had been a fire pit of sorts at one point or another. The officers also found small stains against one of the walls of the cave. They believed that it might have been blood, but beyond that, everything basically remained a mystery. Tristan decided to cut his losses. He salvaged whatever equipment he could to sell it, and then listed the property for sale as well. It took about a year for someone to buy the land from him, but since they did, there was no reported incident similar to Tristan's in that area. No one knows who was in that cave, or why they were tormenting Tristan on his own property, and sadly, that's likely something that will always remain a mystery.